I want to thank very much, as everyone else has, the team here and for the invitation and all of these amazing papers and new colleagues that I've met. And I also want to thank you all whose first language is not English, that you spoke in English, and I feel grateful. And I'm sorry that I only speak English and Spanish and not anything else. It's been a very inspiring, oops, oh, shoot, okay, make that go away, please. Inspiring couple of days, thank you. And I've switched things up a little bit, trying to think about some of the earlier comments and papers that talked about issues of care work and the infinite and the remit to preserve. I thought it would be useful, therefore, to talk a little bit about what this thing, the Vulnerable Media Lab, is. I started as a interdisciplinary scholar in a department of political and social thought and wrote about feminist media art and bodies and technologies. And then I went to Cuba in 1998, and it changed my life. And I started what I feel like was my second PhD, and I continue to work with my colleagues there on numerous projects. And then this lab started, and now I feel like I'm on my third PhD. And thank you for class this last couple of days. I feel like I've learned a great deal. Anyway, what I'd like to do is just take you through a little bit of what the lab is, and I want to kind of show you the building because you know, it's quite spectacular. It's a brand new architectural wonder that sits on the lakefront, and in August we're going to have a Summer Institute in Vulnerable Media. I'll show you a slide later, and maybe you can all come down. But there's been a lot of people working with me on this project, and I am, well, I'm called the director. It feels like more of an administrative function than almost anything else. The people who know a great deal, like Rosaline Hill, who is the director of the Art Conservation Program and a media specialist, who worked with the Inuit Broadcasting Corporation to set up their systems. Dylan Robinson, who's a CRC, a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts, and who's doing a lot of work around issues of repatriation of Indigenous cultural beings, and Tamara Lang, the postdoc that I work with. So the project, what I'm going to do today is go over the lab a bit, and then I'll end the section on the lab with a conversation or a kind of demonstration of what we're doing with one particular set of archive that is by the Ornate Inuit Women's Video Collective. We have a residency with them happening now and an exhibition, so I'll go over that and some of the challenges and questions that that their work raises for us, which bridges actually to Cuba. And so we will go from the very far north, from Igloolik to Havana at some point as the as the talk goes on. So each generation of media artists, broadly defined, builds their practice through a repertoire. Conversations across borders and generations deepen with each new work. Processes of remediation, archive fevers, and the practices of the self-developed nuance. But what happens if a big part of your of the repertoire is lost to you? When your archive is in, say, a national building you can't have access to, when the media materiality has decayed to the point of no longer being, when IP patrimony and other forms of control over the history of place and belonging create blockades against access and critical and or loving conversations with the past. So these questions draw a contiguous relation between the social ecologies and the media ecologies. They're diverse and not convergent, I think, and they are stories. There's a lot of stories that come with this, stories of workarounds, of sharing. In Cuban, we talk about the effort to resolver, to overcome, to resolve, the making do, the overcoming, and finally the disobeying. And these strategies are activated in community-based and artist-run spaces of production, archiving, distribution, and are alive and well in Cuba and in the North. Most national archives have suffered from decades of funding cuts, austerity policies, and so forth. Moving image archives have seen this acutely, but as we've been talking about, digital media archives, apparently both ubiquitous and infinitely accessible, apparently, are even more vulnerable to disappearance and the inability to retrieve. Add to this the reality that audiovisual cultural heritage has not been cared for equally, and that the cultural practices of women, LGBTQ2, immigrant, and indigenous peoples are in urgent need of dedicated archival frameworks and differentiated archival praxis. To address the variable vulnerabilities from material fugitive elements and ecologies to embodiments, sovereignties, and affects, we engage collaborators and students working with archives from perspectives that work the material, cultural, ethical, or political vulnerabilities of audiovisual archives. Vulnerability in the context of our collective work takes us beyond the simple binaries of victimology and into a phenomenology and agential responsibilities of researchers, communities, and the archives themselves. So the Archive Counter-Archive Research Project is Canadian from sea to sea, from north to the border, and is working with a number of levels of community-based archives, like the Toronto Gay and Lesbian Archive, which now is called Queer-Ive, like anyway, I can't say it right. As well as VTape, this Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center, as well as TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, and the Quebec Cinémathèque Québécoise, and a variety of scales, in other words, of organizations. So we're working with them and a series of case studies that will allow us to do more or less what the colleague earlier has described as documenting, researching, interviewing, describing, and digitizing, finally, the work. The reason for that digitization is, on the one hand, of course, obviously preservation, but the other reason for it is to advance the work into a process of remediation. And so we see the project overall in the Vulnerable Media Lab and in Archive Counter-Archive as a project committed to creating the conditions for a living archive. And that means that we think about preservation as in terms of presentation, in terms of remediation, in terms of intervention, and so forth. So the researchers, the folks whose work we're dealing with, largely people who have been sort of marginalized from the major institutions, have robust audiovisual histories, and they are media makers that often turn their lenses and microphones on colonial and patriarchal archives, thus displaying the operations of exclusion and making these archives vulnerable to critical and public scrutiny. The researchers involved aim to develop methods and processes to ensure this media history is preserved and made available according to culturally specific and ethically driven forms of access, and thus engaging in new conversations about cultural heritage. And because the the focus on Indigenous material, Indigenous beings, and one of our researchers, a doctoral student who's also an artist and is an Anishinaabe artist. His job in the Agnes Etherington Art Gallery collection is to go into the collection and ask the ancestors, what us settlers would have probably called objects, if what they would like to have done with them, what would they like to do. And so there is no assumption anymore inside that institution that we work very closely with that these are dead objects. So the throw of agency back into the work that's been collected requires then following up with these forms of activation and finding ways for those, for example, those ancestors to speak and to listen to them. So that's something I've been learning a lot about. The other thing I've been learning about is like stuff like this, because, you know, I'm a theorist. And now there's this big lab with all of these elements in it that we have technical directors and incredible archivists and digital humanities archivists who work with us on this infrastructure. So this is one, we do have an archive room. I raised a whole bunch of money because our university had absolutely no Foundation for Innovation funding in the humanities and arts. And so they said to me, go for it. And I did, and I got $1 million, and almost half of that went into the actual archive room itself, because when they built that beautiful building I showed you a picture of, they had a room called the archive room, but it had no climate control. And there was an air conditioner in there, and then all of our 16 millimeter assets. So what we did was clean that room out. We've got it perfect archival quality air in there, and that cost like $300,000 for air. Anyway, we were able to then also do a lot of purchasing, buying scanners and a whole suite of video transfer, a lot of software. But for me, what's perhaps most, I mean, this is all very exciting too, I must say, but for me, what's particularly exciting is the ways in which the other elements of the lab are working with communities. So we have a screening room for, looking at stuff, and it's very nice. But we have a mobile media unit, so we can bring the work back to community. Or one of the projects I'm working on is a collection of work from the Video In, Video Out Vancouver-based organization, and they have a collection of Women in Focus video that was started in 1972, and we're remediating that, working intergenerationally, working with, that collection was made by second wave feminists, and there was a lot of tension, social tension, the social ecology of that period. Now we're bringing that into conversation with a generation of students who are both critical and fascinated by this history, and so they're going to intervene in that archive and make new work, and we're going to, with our big high lumens projector, coordinate a series of screenings on International Women's Day and project some of the work, like Rape is a Social Disease, now remediated by contemporary Indigenous and Black and queer actors. And project those onto city halls across the country over a set of weeks. we have a video wall that's going to be installed in the Center for Indigenous Arts as well. So right now we have a series of projects that we're working on actively in the lab. And those include the Inuit Women's Video Collective, as well as the Vulnerable Media of the Americas project. And that's working with a number of colleagues in the US and in Latin America who have labs, who are working with community-based organizations, working with Video in the Villages, for example, in Brazil, to create a kind of network and an opportunity for infrastructure sharing, because I think that this is a huge kind of problem around the way in which the North, or this kind of medium North that I live in, becomes the place where everyone has to go because we've got the stuff. So how do we actually work our systems of economies and policies to shift the access to the South? So there's a number of projects that are going on simultaneously. We've got about 15 graduate students and a whole network of researchers working on those. So I don't need to go through that because you all know about that. I want to talk just for 1 minute before I move into the Ornate project about one of the remits that we have, I guess, around what's the word? Presentation and preservation is actually about repatriation. So Dylan Robinson is working very hard on a project around this Sibley Watson film that you may have seen, Nass River Indians from 1927, which was hanging out in a kind of decaying state in the Canadian Library Archives Canada. It was slightly, taken care, restored by our colleague Linda Jessup, and then with some moderation of the intertitles to highlight the colonial history that underscored the original production. But one of the things that happened, of course, is that there's, you can see in this image, is that the community was speaking their stories, and those were being recorded on wax cylinders. The wax cylinders are housed in the Canadian Museum of History, and they won't repatriate them. So we're trying to figure out how to do that and how to use the lab as a means by which to actually enact a process of repatriation of those voices. And so one of the things that we're considering, that we're working on doing, is having a performance and a ceremony where we bring the Kitsayak dancers from the West Coast to the Canadian Museum of History, and we facilitate for them a process whereby those cylinders become repatriated to that community. And so this is following through on the idea of the living archive, right? Because we're not interested really in preservation itself. We're not a museum. We're a lab and a research process. And so one of this recent project that we're working on right now with the elders from the Ornate, from Igloolik, involves, they asked us to hold their archive. And when we had a conversation with them, I asked them, what do you want us to do with it? Like, how far should we digitize it? Do you have protocols we need to be aware of? Is there anything you don't want touched? Is there anything you don't want to have accessible? And they said, absolutely not. We want you to digitize everything, because that's why we made it, to make it accessible to the next generation. So what this project is with their residency, they'll be in residence for 10 days, and every day the exhibition will change, and the material in the exhibition will continue to change over the course of the 4 months in relation to their instruction. So we're going to have them kind of unpack their archive in a set of workshops where various generations come together and they tell stories about that material. Okay, so now, it's really interesting that, you know, here we have this amazing lab, all these facilities, great internet, and so on, to work with these women whose stories they created, you know, 25 years ago, this amazing collective in order to record and share the stories of their community and of their ancestors. And they have no internet that's reliable, and they have their actual website is maintained in Montreal. And so how do they distribute their work, right? So they distribute it in various ways. They have community gatherings, it's on flash drives, it is on DVDs, they have mobile units that go to different places. They work with schools and things like that. So that instability and unequal access, that digital differential that describes the North in terms of these technologies as well as clean drinking water, is something that we find also happening in Cuba. So how do Cubans deal with this? Now, I don't know what time it is. I have 5 minutes. Okay. So what I'm going to do very, very quickly is take you through a phenomenon that is very particularly Cuban in many ways, but as this kind of relationship and mirroring to other geographies. In '91, Cuba, that was really the real start of the special period, you know, the fall of the wall and so on, right? Where 85% of the Cuban economy disappeared. That was also when the internet arrives everywhere else. And there's 2 generations, therefore, who were raised when 1991 happened. 2 generations were raised after the revolution with first world education standards. And a lot of engineers who came to places like this to study. And so what's interesting in this shift of what happens in their social ecology in this period means that they have to figure out other ways to, as my research associate calls it, how to stay connected in an offline world. Since 2013, Cuban authorities have taken significant steps toward the regularization of public internet access on the island. But before that date, policies regarding the internet benefited specific sectors and limited the broader access of most Cubans. Cubans managed to stay current, creating original alternatives or adjusting pre-existing initiatives to get access to information and knowledge. In her research, Xenia Reloba builds on Don Slater's concept of communicative ecologies and communicative assemblages, defining the Cuban communicative ecosystem as a combination of online and offline alternatives to access, in order to access information and enable communication needs. Such alternatives involve human agents, tools, and media that work within institutional, irregular, and illegal networks. Those networks coexist not necessarily in harmony with everyday life in Cuba. Rather than disappearing with internet access, the irregular and illegal aspects of the communicative ecosystem continue to emerge and develop, providing in some cases a more suitable and contextually meaningful solutions in a context of scarcity. The emergence of irregular and illegal networks is an expression of agency in the face of the information and communication technologies. And she argues that Cubans' agency reflects a cultural sense of connectedness based on imaginaries about modernity, modernization, and development and normality that have been part of the Cuban tradition since its formation as a nation. In this particular, there's a series of these irregular and illegal processes that have been invented, including the paquete semanal, which is basically a flash drive, but it's big, and it is a distribution network. It's where net artists, where digital artists, where Modern Family, where how to fix your toilet, everything exists in the paquete. So artists have been using the paquete as a means to distribute work and to share. So the paquete is the weekly package. It compiles also news and all sorts of other media, and is really used by about 80% of the population. Victor Fowler calls it the Internet of the Poor. They also use local networks like the SNet and nanoreceptors in order to maintain neighborhood and social ecology connections, to share and build games together in neighborhood contexts. They invented something called Connectify, where you can go to an outdoor hotspot and work with somebody else's connection to the net. They have something called Zappia, as well as shared internet accounts. The Cuban artist Ernesto Oroza coined the concept of technological disobedience to define a series of creative day-to-day practices involving objects of everyday life, taking place especially during the 90s. And this notion includes the process of accumulation, reparation, or reutilization of obsolete technology in contexts of scarcity. According to him, the disobedience lies in the inherent challenge that such practices pose to the current logic of technologic development and consumption of industrialized objects under a system of state control. So I'm going to very quickly now just show you a few examples of some of the artists, and interestingly, they're all dudes. So I don't know, I've been working with a curator in Havana to try and actually do some gender mining to see whether or not we can develop an interesting set of exhibitions that have a little more diversity. But in this case, like Abel Barroso, his father was one of those engineers who actually came to Hungary to study, and then went home, and together at the end of the 90s they began this project called the Cafe Internet, the Third World Cafe. Internet cafe. Everything is made of wood, and these hand cranks actually crank, and the images are pixelated images that you can dream impossible dreams through. And third world Bluetooth connections. So funny, crafty, craftsmanship made of wood, but also, a project between generations. And I think that's really, in some ways, super interesting. Also, the cafe itself is an actual cafe. Like, you can go in and have coffee and have a sandwich and talk to people and stuff. And And then there's these non-functioning computers there that, but you're actually building social connection and not not other forms of connection or internet connection. The Fengito eStudio is an incredible project, and they have done a number of digital works, and really in some ways the digital and the internet are for them discursive spaces where they get to investigate social power and political power. And so a lot of the projects they do are projects that, for example, in Naked Link, here is a work that explores the boundaries between data visualization and art made from data collection, which actually maps out the hotspots and shows the ways in which surveillance of users are being documented by the state, both in Miami and in Havana. So that's an ongoing project. Again, these kinds of events that they do end up in things like alternative biennales or the off-biennale projects, and they have annual gatherings. Anyway, I'm going to stop because I'm going really over time. Thank you. Oh, and here. There.
Thank you very much.
And you could come to the Institute.